50, 100 eyeballs of the right people. And so that's kind of what happened. We had a lot of excitement.
So, hi everyone. After 3 years, finally get the chance to speak with Chris, who's building Hanover. And yeah, super excited for this new territory here. I'd love to dive into Hanover and what exactly are you building over there? And I know you just recently launched, like you just put it out in the world, like you just recently had a launch. So, like, how did that launch go? Like, what was the traction like, or like what was the outcome of that launch, and how do you have a successful launch?
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, we launched recently, I would say about 2 weeks ago from today. And what we're building is, a venture fund and private equity fund's final operating system. And what that actually means is if you think about like all of the back office that they currently work with, and so they hire these people called fund admins that do all of the accounting and reporting for their limited partners. And so we said we have to go to the bottom of the well and chew the glass is what I call it, and build our own general ledger from scratch to actually be able to enable to do all the accounting and reporting. And then we married the unsexy services piece with software and AI on top to say, okay, now we've built the system of record, we've built the accounting system, we can execute your unsexy accounting and reporting. Now we have an AI co-pilot on top where people can query their data and say, who are our top 5 portfolio companies by revenue growth? What are pro rata rights we have for Fund 4? And so now we're like offering like software and AI on top that's pretty interesting on top of like an unsexy services thing. And so that's what we're doing. That's what we're building. We launched to $1 billion in assets under administration on the platform, serving typically venture funds over $100 million in assets. The way I thought about launch is there's a lot of different ways to approach this. If you are selling a $20 a month, Calendly type product where, your goal is to get volume of people to try the product, maybe on a freemium, you would maybe launch on Product Hunt. You'd do a bunch of different things. For us, all I was focused on, it was putting out the bat signal to the right 1, 5, 10, 50, 100, 500 funds that would be directly in our initial ICP. Because at the end of the day, because of the size of the contracts, we're really just trying to attract the right set of customers and having them know who we are. And so instead of trying to launch 15 different places, instead of trying to do Product Hunt, instead of trying to do all this different stuff, I really just thought about every single decision we made on launch was how will we attract 10, 50, 100 eyeballs of the right people? And so that's kind of what happened. We had a lot of excitement post-launch, and it's been a good start so far.
Wow, that's amazing that you mentioned that you had 1 billion in assets under management. That's super impressive. So, like, would love to get your take now on kind of the opportunity that you had to work with Shanpur. I think it's you have an amazing resume, like amazing things you've done. You've worked at Goldman Sachs, you worked at Meow, you became their chief revenue officer in like under a year, I guess, and now you're building Hanover. But I think it's good to dive deep into also like what you were doing as well, like in your past as well, like in terms of like the Shanpuri apprenticeship. And I don't think I've seen like many tweets or things where like you talk about that a lot. So I would love to know kind of like what were some of the biggest lessons that you learned from working with Shan, and just what did you kind of imbibe from him and from that culture of work that he created that you've kind of implemented as well into Hanover or to any of those other startups that you worked for?
Yeah, I think a lot about this idea of like proof of work instead of just like asking for something. And so think about when you apply for a job, right? And so when you apply for a job, you might submit an application and put your resume in of saying, this is what I can do. You should give me a job. Or if you apply for a job, say you're a marketer, you could literally send to the startup, here's how I'd rewrite your landing page, and here's the example. That is actually doing work, and that's proof you can do the job better than anybody else. And so when I thought about, attracting the attention of someone like Sean, who had a few 100,000 followers at the time, I had a few hundred, right? I was a no-name college kid. He was someone that everyone knew about. And so, there was a tweet by Sam Parr, his co-host of My First Million, that said like, hey, I don't know how Sean went from 30 to 100,000 followers. This is insane. Can someone explain this to me? I replied immediately within 5 minutes and said, I'm going to be the guy to figure this out. Let me come back. 2 hours later, I had done all the research, written a thread, and replied to that tweet saying, hey, this is the reason why Sean went from 30 to 100,000. Here's exactly what we learned. Here's exactly what he did. That is the idea of proof of work in action, of just like hustling and making things happen beyond just like asking someone for a job. And then from that, Sean DM'd me and I ended up, I worked for him for a few months, helping him write some content and doing some other stuff there. And it really kind of taught me what excellence looked like in writing. And so that's kind of the story of that. And I think it's really important to think about, like, how do you stand out and escape competition? Sending a resume in is what everyone does. And so how do you do the thing that no one does, which typically involves proof of work?
Yeah, and I think it's really good that you mentioned about proof of work, because I've also been thinking a lot about this concept of proof of work and how can someone get do the work kind of before they get the job. I think that's kind of hitting home what you've kind of mentioned today. And proof of work is a pretty interesting concept. Like, I know a few people that are trying to kind of solve for that space as well, and they're doing amazing stuff as well. So my next kind of question is, so you were just mentioning about like how you are no name kind of person from Yale, and like, so how did you exactly build your network from the ground up? Like, you went from like zero to like, at some point you must have had zero till about 100K plus followers and X. So how did that kind of happen? And like, what were some of those tactical things or practical things that you implemented that kind of made this whole thing happen for you? And like, yeah, we'd just love to learn that as well.
I call it credibility hacking. And so when I was back in Yale, there was this, typically I'd say like the average startup club in college is kind of BS. There's not really a lot of value that it does. And it's kind of resume padding, which I hate. And so what I did is I joined this Yale startup club and I said, hey, no need to, you can just leave me alone. I know this may not matter to you guys, but I can be the head of speakers and podcasts, and I can just reach out and cold email a bunch of Yale founders and ask them to talk live with me in front of, 200 people. And so that was step one of credibility hacking, is join a Yale startup club and then email people that were Yale founders and say, hey, I'm the head of speakers and podcasts for this Yale startup club, right? That frames something completely differently than emailing strangers who have no connection to you. And so the chance of success, meaning the chance of them being able to go on a show that I could host for 100 or 200 people, was much higher than me randomly emailing someone. And so like credibility hacking was the first part. The second part is like every single touch point that they felt during that experience leading up to the interview and after the interview needed to be a 10x experience. That means I did more research for those interviews than anyone thought was physically possible. I read every blog they've ever written. I read every tweet they ever wrote. I consumed every podcast they've ever been on. I've seen everything they've ever done. And then I would send a list of really, really detailed questions that they'd never been asked before, 24 to 48 hours before the interview. So that was step one, was like, okay, credibility hacking into this idea of, wow, now this person has really done the work, back to proof of work. Then, live, I'd over prepared and, it was a pretty good experience. And then I would take that interview. I would then spend a bunch of time writing really good Twitter threads from that. So dropping it into like 5 or 10 tweets that were all linked together during 2020 and 2021 that had a hook of, I interviewed the guy who invented Amazon Prime. Here's what I learned, right? And so post that experience, that would usually get some traction and people would be like, wow, that's actually pretty interesting and differentiated. And I would send that Twitter thread to them to say, hey, this got 1 million impressions. People liked what you heard. Would love to stay in touch. So like that, every single step of the process, from credibility hacking to get my foot in the door, to over delivering in the preparation, to over delivering in the interview, to then reposting and repurposing that content, to getting eyeballs on that, to then resending that to them, builds a lot of trust with them. And then from there, I'd kind of continue to just like maintain the relationship, checking in with them and sending them stuff I was building and working on in the next, every 6 months or so. And so that's kind of how I think about tactically building something from zero.
So let's kind of dive into that concept of compounding and the compounding nature of relationships as well. Like, I think I saw you had a blog post on that, or some kind of tweet or something. I'm not too sure, like, correct me if I'm wrong in that. But yeah, we'd just love to get your thoughts on that as well before we kind of end the conversation.
Sure. I think a lot about this idea of compounding. And so if you think about like everyone knows at this point that when it comes to money, if you compound your money and put it in the S&P 500 and earn 7% a year for 25 or 30 years, at the end of those 30 years, you will be blown away by how much money you will actually have. That's like a common concept. And the idea of just like buy, hold for a long time, and you will be delighted and happy about that. And, Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger always talked about how this idea of like, you don't want to interrupt compounding unnecessarily. Meaning, if you have your money in there for 7% for 5 years and then you pull it out and then wait 3 years and then put it back in, you're interrupting the compounding, right? Which at the end of the day, your returns will be much lower. I have applied this concept to every aspect of my life, right? And so when I think about relationships and friendships, I think to myself, like, is this someone I want to compound with for the next 20 years, 30 years, 40 years? Because the returns on that relationship, the trust that you've built, the relationship that you have is super different for someone that you can completely trust and have known for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, than if you're constantly interrupting compounding and trying to get a new friend group every 2 years. And so I think a lot about this. And so, a lot of the decision making I have when it comes to even things outside of, money, when it comes to relationships and when it comes to all these other things, it's like, is this someone or something I want to compound on for 10 years, 20 years? Because all the greatest returns come from this patience. And so, patience in the long term, but impatience in day-to-day decision making is kind of the framework I think about.
Yeah, I honestly loved all the frameworks that you shared today. I think this is one of the framework heavy kind of episodes that I've recorded. One of the most kind of heavy kind of topics as well that we covered. And so, yeah, do share like how the audience can get in touch, how they can like learn more about what you guys are building over at Hanover, and yeah, just how they can learn more about the cool things that you're doing over there.
Sure. Yeah. If you're interested, you can just follow me at Chris Hlad on Twitter. Or you can check out our website, hanover.co. So yeah, I'm pretty easy to find.
Amazing. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast and for making this happen after 3 years. Was it honestly a pleasure and an honor to speak with you.
Let's do it. This is great.